Welcome to the Daily Devo. My name's Bob Bryant, and today we're talking about how doing good silences the fools. Are you old enough to remember the TV show called The A-Team? It's called The A-Team, and there was one particular character on this TV show called Mr. T. He was a large man, really muscular, and he had an interesting voice, a really deep, strong voice. But there was one line in it that I thought was relevant today, and I'll do my best imitation of Mr. T. He says, "Shut up, fool!" And so he kept saying that to people. That was one of his catch lines, this "shut up, fool." And so this idea is when we do good, God silences the enemies. When we do the right thing in the midst of the wrong thing, when we endure unjust suffering the right way, God silences or shuts up the fools who are causing the evil. Another biblical illustration, I was telling my wife that I was going to do the Mr. T imitation, and she said, first, you're old because she didn't remember that TV show. And secondly, you should do a better biblical illustration. So here's the biblical illustration. Do you remember when the very poor woman went to see Jesus and she gave all she had? She gave like 2 pennies, but that was everything that she had. And the Jewish leaders made fun of her, scoffed at her. She was giving nothing compared to their gifts. And Jesus looked at them and he silenced the fools by saying this woman gave out of her sacrifice. She gave something that sacrificed her offering. That's all she had, but they gave out of their wealth. And they can give a much bigger amount, but it wasn't a sacrifice to them. And in this, Jesus silences the fools, the evildoers. Would you join me in 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 15? For this is the will of God, that by doing good, you should put to silence the ignorance of foolish people. By doing good, you put to silence the ignorance of foolish people. Fools get shut up by God. We don't need to do that part of the work. One thing I wanted to talk to you today about is this idea of an inequality gap. I'm sure there's a better word for it, but this is the best I got. It's this idea that when you are doing the right things in life, sometimes unjust things happen, unfair things happen, and it creates this gap that I'm going to call it's inequality. They might have discriminated against you. They might have demeaned you and dehumanized you. They might have treated you unfairly or unjustly, and there's this inequality gap. What do we do in the midst of this inequality gap? Yesterday, we talked about you could retaliate, you could do revenge, you could try to correct the wrong. But God says when we do the good thing in the midst of the inequality gap, it's a divine opportunity for them to glorify God. Let's look at this verse in a broader context, starting in verse 13. Be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether it be to the emperor as supreme or to the governors as sent by him to punish those who do evil, to praise those who do good. For this is the will of God, that by doing good you should put to silence the ignorance of foolish people. Live as people who are free, not using your freedom as a cover-up for evil, but living as servants of God. Honor everyone, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the emperor. Peter was writing this book in the times that Nero was becoming the emperor of the Roman Empire. And Nero was terrible, one of the worst leaders ever in the way of he persecuted, killed, tortured, just dehumanized the believers of God. In addition, Pilate was still in the Roman Empire. You remember Pilate from Jesus' day. He's the one that allowed the Jewish leaders to put him up on a cross. Peter is telling his readers, obey, submit to the governing authorities. And you got to be saying, why in the world would Peter tell them to submit? He says in verse 15 that this is the will of God, that Christians are supposed to be model citizens following our governing authority, even though we know that as elect exiles, we are not ultimately under the authority of humans, that we are citizens of heaven. We are citizens of the kingdom of God, and God is our king. And yet we are to submit just as Jesus did. He modeled it for us when he was here. You probably remember these verses from Romans 13. Let every person be subject to governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. God is the one that institutes authorities and governing authorities. It doesn't mean that they are God's people on earth, but they are God's choice to run and be authorities, and we are called to submit to them. Every president, every Congress, every boss, every manager, supervisor is going to create an inequality gap with you. Every one of them. Democrats or Republicans felt it for the last 4 years, an inequality gap. Democrats are going to feel the inequality gap for the next 4 years. But even us at work, when we have a boss above us, there's going to be a feeling of unfairness and injustice. They don't understand us. They don't really get us. Why won't they let us do? There's this inequality, injustice, unfairness. And what do we do in the midst of it? I'll tell you what Daniel did in the book of Daniel. He submitted to the authorities of the Babylon, and they raised him up to be number 2 of Babylon. And he said things that were for God, even in the midst of this heretical culture. And God shut the mouths of fools. In fact, God shut the mouths of lions when Daniel was found to be praying and violating a law. And God can shut the mouths of people and beasts. Joseph, when his brothers condemned him and were going to kill him and throw them in, then they threw him into slavery, and Pharaoh's wife slanderously accused him, and they threw him into prison. He was raised up to second in charge of all Egypt, where he, by God's vision, saved so many nations from famine. And when his brothers came back around, they had been shut up as fools. When we do the right thing in the midst of injustice and unfairness, God will shut the mouths of the foolish people up.